Hello, my name's Ed Bridges. I'm Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Academy of Social Sciences, and I'm going to talk you through a piece of work that the Academy did last year to look at how different governments around the world incorporate social science insights, expertise, research, and thinking into their policy making. This was a sister project to a much bigger piece of work that the Academy has recently launched, where we have looked at the structures, approaches, and mindsets within UK government and the potential opportunities that exist for the better harnessing of social science evidence within UK government policy making processes. But the piece of research that I'm going to be talking to you about was a sister project to that, where we carried out a series of interviews in spring and summer 2024 with participants from 9 different countries to look at how governments in other parts of the world draw on social science research as they implement and develop public policy. And we did that to try and understand what lessons the UK might learn from experiences elsewhere around the globe. Caveats apply. This report does not claim to be an in-depth, systematic and comprehensive review of policy making, but it is a timely and light touch comparison between a small set of examples, which we think all share some overlapping features with the UK. In total, we spoke to 24 people across 9 countries, at least 2 from each nation, and we tried to make sure that we had a balance of those outside of government, but also those who've worked either within or close to governments to get a range of perspectives. And there were 8 key learning points that came out of the conversations that we had. I won't go through all of them, but I will just pick out a few of the ones that you see here. So firstly, this point about times of crisis provide opportunities for social sciences to underpin policy. Most obviously, of course, that was true of COVID-19, but we also saw it in places like Ireland around the 2008 financial crash, which caused a reappraisal of their use of evidence within the Irish government. The Scottish devolution referendum in 1997, again, a really interesting example of where political science in particular played an important role within kind of constitutional matters. The second point about individual relationships between politicians, civil servants and social scientists mattering, you would expect that to be the case, and we did see that within some of the smaller nations that we looked at, Scotland, Ireland, New Zealand, there were opportunities and disadvantages relating to this. On the one hand, relationships to academics were often much closer than they might have been in bigger nations, and that led to a good way in, perhaps, for academics to engage with policy making. But equally, it sometimes meant that those lacking those personal connections could find themselves out of the loop when it came to assisting the policy process, and that was particularly true for social scientists. The big point for me was the third point about the lack of visibility for how government policy making teams operated. We saw this very, very clearly across most of the places that we studied. The exceptions were the European Commission and to a lesser extent New Zealand and Norway, where there were clearer diagrams and organograms which set out how policy making was done and how people could feed into it. But in most cases, it was just the fact that government policy making was seen as being quite opaque and quite hard to feed into. Other points that we see here, so for example, number 6, emphasis on STEM rather than social science, stronger in English-speaking countries. So countries within mainland Europe and the European Commission itself had a much more positive view and inclusive view of social science evidence. They saw science as including social sciences by definition, whereas within English-speaking countries, there tended to be this view of STEM on the one hand and other subjects on the other, particularly social sciences and humanities, sitting outside of that, which we thought was quite interesting. Let's move on then to have a look at some of the individual takeaways from each of the nations. So Australia then, COVID was an important prompt, as was the case in a lot of nations. For me, the interesting takeaway in Australia was that although there was a strong feeling that the social sciences had not been at the heart of policy making. There was a sense that things were changing. A recent agreement between the Australian government and their Council of Learned Academies will see the development of research projects on how best to solve policy problems. That was seen to be an opportunity. Canada, I think I've already mentioned. This interesting point about the Anglo-American definition of science was seen to be about scientific method, and the social sciences tended to fall outside of that mindset, whereas the Francophile definition was much more about codified knowledge in general, and therefore included the social sciences. The European Commission, meanwhile, had the clearest and most transparent process for linking research with policy, and you see it set out in the diagram that you can see here. It wasn't always felt to be perfect and effective, but it was clear for researchers to see where they could feed into the system. It was also interesting that on a kind of macro level, the vision and principles underpinning ideals of a social Europe have undoubtedly made EU structures more open to incorporating social science advice. Within Germany, again, we see this point about Germany not distinguishing between social science and STEM and natural sciences. The social sciences were seen to be very much part of science advice more generally. Interesting that social sciences were also more highly regarded than the humanities. That was the point that came through. So there is still this sort of hierarchy of knowledge. Meanwhile, in Ireland, I think I made reference to it earlier, the 2008 financial crisis was a big prompt for change, with the Irish government suddenly seeking more external advice on policy development, particularly around economic matters. New Zealand was probably the only nation where we saw a significant divergence of views amongst our interviewees, with some having a very positive sense of how their government used evidence and social sciences within their policy making, and some who were more critical. But there was consensus that political leadership mattered, and a feeling that the previous government, the Labour government, was much more willing to take social science evidence on board than the current administration. Norway was interesting because unlike most of the other nations covered in this report, it does not include a large cadre of scientific and special advisors within government. Instead, you have the Norwegian government drawing on expertise from outside, from research institutes, universities, and other institutions. But within government, you have decision making left very much to bureaucrats within their civil service, and I thought it was fascinating that they had a much more positive view towards the term bureaucrat. You know, in a modern UK context, it's a term that has quite pejorative connotations, but within Norway, it was seen as a description of smooth, effective governance by a dedicated and apolitical group of civil servants. And I thought that was interesting, a small linguistic difference that spoke volumes about how about the different political cultures which exist between the two nations. Scotland, of course, has a chief social researcher and chief social policy advisor within Scottish government. Those were felt to have brought about significant and clear benefits to policy. But interestingly, that was seen to have been the case more because they changed mindsets and cultures rather than because of the positions themselves. Whilst in the US, our interviews preceded the re-election of Donald Trump for his second term. At the time we were having the conversations, there was optimism about the blueprint for the use of social and behavioural science to advance evidence-based policy making, a report within the US, but most likely things are in a different place now. So this is a piece of work that will sit as an appendix to the main project, which has a much clearer UK government focus, and as it says here, has captured discussions with senior people within UK government about how they feel evidence from and beyond the social sciences can be used in the policy process, and we hope that we can take that conversation more widely in the months ahead. But this separate international piece, we are keen to use it to inform further discussions with others in the social science sector to think what learnings we can take forward. So thank you very much for listening. I hope it's been of interest, and if you'd like to get in touch to find out more, then drop me a line. Thanks very much.